For centuries, Jews were persecuted in almost all European countries. They were pushed to the margins of society because of their faith and in some cases completely excluded. The persecution of the Jews reached its climax during the Second World War, one of the darkest chapters in history. To ensure that this history would never be repeated, a plan was put into practice that had been discussed since the 19th century. The Jews were to be given their own state in which they could live peacefully. Thus, in 1948, the State of Israel was finally founded in the Middle East under the protection of the USA. However, the location in the Middle East was actually only one of many proposals. Originally, there were plans for a Jewish state in Albania, but there were also plans for a state in the USA, Uganda, and Eastern Russia. In total, 30 different places were considered for a possible Jewish state. Today we take a look at some of these places, why these proposals were ultimately rejected, and why the Middle East was chosen in the end. Enjoy the video. The first plans began in the early 19th century. One of the first proposals dates back to 1820, when Mordecai Manuel Noah was one of the first to advocate Zionism, i.e. the establishment of a Jewish state. The New York politician bought a large part of Grand Island, which was located in the Niagara River in the state of New York. He founded the city of Ararat, which was named after the resting place of Noah's Arkansas. However, very few people were actually convinced by the plan at the time, which is why it was abandoned after a short time. The British plan was much more successful. They were also committed to a separate homeland for all Jews and therefore developed the British Uganda program. The aim was to give the Jewish people a part of British East Africa as a homeland. The British presented the offer to the founder of the Zionist Society, Theodore Herzl, who presented the plan at the Sixth Zionist Congress in 1903. The Uganda program was hotly debated at the time, but was ultimately rejected. The reason for this was that a large part of the proposed territory was already populated by the Maasai, and the country was also considered rather dangerous due to its flora and fauna. In addition, at this time there were already initial voices in favor of founding a state in Palestine. These supporters feared that this idea would become impossible if the Uganda program was accepted. In 1928, the Soviet Union finally intervened in the question of a Jewish nation. It offered the Zionists a place in the far east of Russia, near the border with China, as a settlement area. However, the Soviet leadership did not do this out of altruism, but was actively pursuing a plan to settle Jews in this area. Large parts of the Russian Far East were virtually uninhabited at the time. Attempts had already been made in vain for several decades to attract settlers to this region. Now the Jews were to be moved to this region through propaganda. However, the Jewish community in the Soviet Union was mainly rooted in the West, in what is now Ukraine and Belarus. As a result, many Jews accused Stalin of anti-Semitism, as it seemed as if he wanted to remove the Jews as far as possible from the center of power in the Soviet Union. The plan was therefore doomed to failure from the outset, especially as the region on offer had extreme climatic conditions, consisted largely of marshland, and the Chinese border was considered extremely dangerous. Nevertheless, there was another, relatively realistic plan for a Jewish state in Europe. In 1935, the British Zionist journalist Leo Elton traveled to Albania, which was considered very Jewish-friendly and was one of very few countries with no history of Jewish persecution. He held talks with the Albanian government, which welcomed Jewish immigration and assured him that religious intolerance was relatively unknown in Albania. As Leo Elton wrote in his travel report, there is no reason to believe that Jewish settlers would not live in complete harmony with the various elements of the population. The land also had the advantage of being completely cut off from industrialized Europe, but offered extremely fertile soil for agriculture. It was expected that the needs of at least 5 million Jewish inhabitants could be met in this way. Nevertheless, the plan ultimately failed. The reasons are no longer clear today, but the plan probably came too close to the Second World War. The systematic persecution of Jews in Europe was already in full swing, and in 1939 Albania was finally occupied by Italy, later by the German Reich. And after the war, the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine was then promoted by the USA, as a result of which all other plans were discarded. Nevertheless, the Albanians' appreciation of the Jews was also evident during the World War. Despite the occupation by the Axis powers, all of the country's Jews were hidden and protected so that they all survived. After the war, the number of Jews was even greater than before, as Albania was seen as a safe anchor in war-torn Europe.